All right, so here we are, and we are looking at this reading by Hans-Georg Gadamer, who, as I said in the introduction, was a student of Martin Heidegger's. And he writes his magnum opus very late in his academic career in 1960. And we're looking at a passage from towards the end of his big book, which is called Truth and Method. And I'll say a little bit more about the title perhaps next week. But for now, we just want to make our way through this roughly 15 pages of text and pick out a few key concepts. Okay, so let me just gather my notes, which I should have done, but let me just grab this here. All right. Okay. I especially wanted you to think about three different sections of this text. So let's just do what we normally do. Start by acclimatizing ourselves to the reading and asking ourselves, how are we gearing into this? How are we making sense of this? What are the questions that are coming up for us? And so let's just take a really good look at that first paragraph. We're on page 405. In the earliest times, the intimate unity of word and thing was so obvious that the true name was considered to be part of the bearer of the name, if not indeed a substitute for him. In Greek, the expression for word, onyma, also means name, and especially proper name, i.e. the name by which something is called. The word is understood primarily as a name. But a name is what it is because it is what someone is called and what he answers to. It belongs to its bearer. The rightness of the name is confirmed by the fact that someone answers to it. Thus, it seems to belong to his being. Okay, now this is pretty much a description of animism. The notion that the word and the thing are absolutely tied up with one another. It's a little bit like the idea that you could say abracadabra and the doors would open, that there's a magical, key connection between the word and the thing. And one of the things that makes it difficult for us to embrace the quotation that I gave you in the introduction from Gadamer is that it seems like it's a return to this. It seems like it's a return to a very hokey idea. It goes against every fiber of our being as modern people, or as people who inhabit the modern paradigm. It seems how could this be true? And indeed, thinking with Gadamer, it is a problem, for sure. But think like Aristotle. Think about what your options are. Is it an either or? Well, this is stupid, so I guess we must be, think the opposite, right? That they're not connected. And what we want to do is we want to slow down, and we want to think of ourselves as not being in an either or situation. So we start with this. We might want to say, this isn't totally accurate to say, but it's not bad. We might want to say that this is the pre-Socratic condition. There are pre-Socratic thinkers who are they're complicating this. But we want to think of that, very early time in ancient Greek history. I'm thinking of the timeline that I introduced last week. So when we start the second paragraph, let's keep that timeline in mind and just be thinking about very early times. We get this. Greek philosophy more or less began with the insight that a word is only a name. Ah, right. Oh, okay. Okay, so we can cheat a little bit. I mean, he mentions Heraclitus near the bottom of the page, but we can cheat a little bit and think that, okay, when you think of the beginnings of Greek philosophy, don't you think of Socrates? So we're going to cheat just a little bit. This is so what Socrates does, and certainly what Plato is doing, and when you read through Plato's works, as I did a few years ago as a project, I'd read bits and pieces, but I made it a project after having read a line in a modern Canadian thinker named George Grant about Heidegger and his reading of Plato. I decided to read all of Plato, and then I had to read all of this work by Heidegger that Gadamer was that my philosopher George Grant was talking about in that context. Anyway, when you read all of Plato, or you really read substantial parts of it, it's like he's on bennies. It's like he has just discovered the greatest possible thing. And the word for that we typically use is dialectic, the idea that you can step back from something and you can say either for or against. Well, if we look at it from this point of view, we look at it from this point of view, and he's enjoying that sense of distance, which is predicated on this comment here, that Greek philosophy more or less began with the insight that a word is only a name, that you can get distance from the thing that you are naming, that you are talking about. Again, think about Greek dialogues, right? He's talking with other people, and he imagines these conversations or represents the conversations that Socrates had with his students, right? So we start with this idea of philosophy involving a distinction between the word and the thing. So from there, so you get this line in the middle of that paragraph at the bottom, page 4 or 5. Thereby, the word changed from presenting the thing to substituting for it. Okay, all right. And we get a reference to Cratylus at the bottom of the page. That's the work where Plato most works out his philosophy of language. We don't have time for everything. We could read the Cratylus. I highly recommend it. It's not terribly long. None of the Platonic dialogues is terribly long, and then you have it for yourself. But that's not our priority here. Our priority is to make sense of this reading. So we just use the Cratylus as a point of reference, and here's where we get a couple of terms that I think are worth our bearing in mind. They're not maybe as widespread as the terms univocity and equivocity. Those I think you really should be comfortable with because they come up a lot, and they're really useful for thinking about your own approach to language and how you might want to articulate that. But these two terms are also useful. So the one is conventionalist theory, and the other one, he uses a couple of phrases. The one in italics on page 406 near the bottom is similarity theory. Another phrase that he uses is natural agreement. So these are the two sets, and they're like the equivocity, univocity terms. Conventionalist theory, and that is a term that is very widely used even in contemporary discourse. So it's another good term to really have clear in your head. So conventionalist theory subscribes to the idea that linguistic usage is reached by agreement and practice, and that's the only source of the meaning of words. So that's the one view. And the other view is, if you like, going back to that opening paragraph, thinking that there is a clear natural agreement between the word and the object, and that the task of the speaker is to use the word correctly. And we get a sense of the limitations of both views in the following two paragraphs. So he takes a paragraph to talk about the limits of the idea of conventionalism. This is like the way that Aristotle pulls back from pure equivocity. Now, what Plato is going to do is going to be different from what Aristotle does later. So the thinking is similar. The terminology and where they end up is slightly different, but they're both aware of a problem, and part of that problem involves the extreme or the limit understandings of conventionalism or equivocity on the one hand, or similarity theory or univocity on the other hand. So that's what's laid out in those two paragraphs. And I want to pick it up at the bottom of page 406, where Gadamer says this. Both of these interpretations, note this, both these interpretations of language start from the existence and instrumentality of words and regard the subject matter as something we know about previously from an independent source. So the reason why he says that harkens back to the opening paragraph, where he said, look, these views of language, they belong to Greek philosophy, and Greek philosophy has already begun with it begins with the questioning of a very strict, simplistic, animistic understanding of the relationship between the word and the thing. So both conventionalist theory and similarity theory are predicated on the idea that words are instruments. Now, let me take you back to week 1, where I asked you to write a little minute essay on your view of language. And I will bet you that many of you refer to the idea of language as a tool by which we express our thoughts. Language is a tool by which we get things done in the world. Blah, blah, blah. Language is a tool. And through this reading, I want to pick up on that idea that Gadamer is not happy with that. Gadamer, right? This 20th century philosopher is not happy with the simple notion of language as a tool. There's something missing in that understanding of language. Now, for Plato, the problem with language as a tool is that it can lead, and this is on page 407, and I just love this phrase, that in the wrong hands, language as a tool can lead to demonic technologization. Right? So he is thinking about, see here, the phrase, the word that I want is sophistical. Maybe I should just read for a little bit here. In the third line from the top in 407, in this discussion of contemporary theories of language, Plato wants to demonstrate that no truth can be attained in language. In language's claim to correctness, and that without words, being must be known purely from itself. This radically displaces the problem to another plane. The dialectic which aims to achieve this obviously claims to make thought dependent on itself alone and to open it to its true objects, the ideas, so that the power of words and their demonic technologization in sophistical argument are overcome. The conquest of the sphere of words by dialectic does not, of course, mean that there really is such a thing as knowledge without words, but only that it is not the word that opens up the way to truth. So I think that last sentence with Gadamer is saying, look, don't imagine that really what, Plato and his academy were striving to do was, to conduct their academic discussions, through mime or something like that. They realized that language is going to be involved here somewhere or other, but it's very much about reducing its importance and separating language from the notion of thought. There's a realm of pure thought separate from words. And the reason why he wants that, the reason why he holds that out as the Holy Grail, as it were, is that he sees that language is manipulable, that language can be given over to demonic technologization. And he sees that happening in the sophists. So they may also subscribe to the idea that thought should be separated from language, but they also see that rhetoric is extremely useful for them, and they basically plump for second best. They put all their emphasis, or a large part of their emphasis, on using language, becoming master rhetoricians. And Plato can see that there's a problem with what they're doing, and he refers to it as demonic technologization, or well, that's Gadamer's phrase for the concern that Plato has. Right. So that's pretty good for us by way of starters. So let's just, I next wanted you to, I wanted to pick things up a few pages further along, but let me, before we do that, I guess I want to go to pages 412 and 413. But before I do that, let's just follow the text a little bit on page 408 and 409. And let me just show you how Gadamer now, not just Plato, is concerned about, like, for him, Plato has already given up too much, has created a problem that he can't solve. And that problem is that for, even if he's resisting demonic technologization, he has put language in the position where it can only be a tool. And Gadamer says this in a couple of places. Like, for instance, on page 408, in the first full paragraph, he says, even where Plato moves beyond the level of discussion in the Cratylus and points forward to his dialectic, we find no other relation to language than that already discussed there. Language is a tool, copy constructed and judged in terms of the original, the things themselves. Okay, so Gadamer is accusing Plato of giving us a view of language that sees it as a tool. Notice again at the bottom of page 409. Talking about the limits of conventionalism and etymological intoxication and a certain kind of moderate view. And then he summarizes the discussion on those two pages with this, right at the bottom, page 409. And yet, by keeping within the framework of finding and giving names, the Socratic argument against Cratylus suppresses a number of insights. To say that the word is a tool we construct in order to deal with things for purposes of instruction and differentiation, and so that it is a being that can be more or less adequate to and in accord with its being, fixes the nature of the inquiry into the nature of the word in a dubious manner. So Gadamer is doubtful, dubious about the starting point of thinking of language as a tool. Okay, so we're starting to put pressure on that idea, and we're we're doing it here by drawing attention to the two main options that Plato has presented, conventionalism and similarity theory, and the way that he is negotiating those things. Okay, so there are other good things that we could take from these pages as the argument develops, and obviously I hope we can pick up some of those things as when we get together for discussion. But let's go to the next thing that I want to draw attention to. Okay. He's on page 412. We can see what it is that Plato really wants. So this is Gadamer now ratcheting up his critique of Plato. And we're just following a theme that we've already been looking at. So on page 412, right near the top, he says about 6 or 7 lines, just near the end of that opening paragraph. This association, however, is not that of the word. Rather, it is already logos. Now, and here, okay, so here we have to make a distinction that in Greek conceptuality, that is Greek ways of thinking, the logos is not necessarily a word the way that we think of a word. It has more to do with the disembodied idea of logic. So the association is not that of the word, rather it is already logos. And in such a logos can find its adequate expression. Okay, so thought as adequate expression of the reality of a thing. Thus, the relational ordering that is logos is much more than the mere correspondence of words and things, as is ultimately assumed in the Eleatic doctrine of being and in the copy theory. The truth contained in the logos is not that of a mere perception, not just letting being appear. Rather, it always places being in a relationship, assigning something to it. For precisely this reason, it is not the word, but the logos that is the bearer of truth and also error. But from this, it necessarily follows that being expressed and thus being bound to language is quite secondary. So being expressed, being bound to language, these are things that he tacitly values, right? He doesn't. We're going to get to that. These are secondary in Platonic thought. It's quite secondary to the system of relations within which logos articulates and interprets the thing. And here we get a sentence where that he himself italicizes because it's that important. We see that it is not word but number that is the real paradigm of the noetic. And noetic is a word that means knowable. Number, whose name is obviously pure convention, and whose exactitude consists in the fact that every number is defined by its place in the series, so that it is a pure structure of intelligibility, not in the weak sense of a being validity, but in the strong sense of perfect rationality. This is the real conclusion to which the Cratylus is drawing. Okay, so what Gadamer is doing here is he's giving his reading of the Cratylus, and he's saying that, look, when it comes right down to it, although he presents these two theories, the similarity theory and the conventionalist theory, two things are happening. A, they're both already within the realm of conventionalism because we've moved away from the ancient animistic idea. And B, it really is conventionalism because we can see that what matters to Plato is a realm of pure thought separate from the words, and that the real paradigm for what is knowable is number, not word. And exactitude has something to do with a system of relations like a series of numbers on a number line, or what else does he say here? He says, that every number is defined its place in a series. The pure structure of intelligibility is a system of perfect rationality. Some of you will have heard me use the phrase Greek conceptuality. I just used it earlier. So it's not just Greek concepts, it's a way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking that Plato really articulates, and it's this way of thinking that he puts on a sure footing. And even though Aristotle disagrees with him in some details, Aristotle, as we're going to see from this Gadamer reading, belongs to the same conceptuality. And it's this that Gadamer is challenging, is saying there's an inherent problem here, or at least what we should at least identify, we should at least notice, is that number is what matters. And when you think of number, there's two things that you should think about. One, is this really a complete representation of reality? Can we actually reduce things to numbers? Now, this is very important for scientific description, right? I remember a friend of mine who was a physicist, brilliant man, died at the age of 38 due to cancer, but he had enjoyed a junior research fellowship at Cambridge. He got a highfalutin job in the States, and he talked about how, mathematically, just giving me a very simple example, but how you can mathematically represent the motion of a point on a circle when it's rolling, so a point on a wheel, right? So mathematical redescription is very important in the sciences, and he said, the aim of physics is to give a mathematical description of the way the universe works. But even if you could, and this guy was very near the top of the discipline worldwide, even if you could, would that be the whole of reality? Think back to the opening readings that we did from Carney and from Boersma, from Geit, from Williams. Hidden patterns, hitherto unexplored meanings. There's something about language that we want to suggest is irreplaceable, and that there are dimensions of being that are not necessarily utterly described by the sciences. There's a lot at stake in this. Okay, so that is the key point, I think, that comes out on this couple of pages. And what he's going to do then is he's going to talk about this relationship between words and numbers within a framework that is tacitly, if not explicitly, conventionalist, with the limitations that go along with that. So at the bottom of page 12, he's saying, if the sphere of the logos represents the sphere of the noetic and the variety of its associations, then the word, just like the number, becomes the mere sign of a being that is well defined and hence pre-known. So the being is pre-known apart from the sign. And then he goes on to talk about that. So by the bottom of page 413, we've got the phrase pure sign put in italics. Knowledge is banished to the intelligible sphere, the realm of ideas. Let's run to the top of page 414. And then there's this phrase that, again on page 414 near the top, that the true being of things is to be investigated without names, means that there is no access to truth in the proper being of words as such. So this puts a limited value on words, on language. You can't seek there for truth in the proper being of words. Words can only be a tool. Okay. On pages 414 and 415 and over through to the top of page 416, we begin to get the complication of that idea, the outworking of that idea in the Western tradition, and also just we get the sense of a bit of an undertow. And we've seen already that he's not happy. We know that he's got concerns with this notion of language as a mere tool, and we see that he is wrestling with, for instance, the development of scientific terminology, the bottom page 414. We see at the top of page 415, using a word as a technical term is an act of violence against language. You see that, he's pointing out certain problems here. Mathematical symbolism is mentioned at the bottom page 415. In that context, he brings up the name of a philosopher named Leibniz. We don't really need to get into the details of Leibniz's thought. What we want to do is, let's just pick up a couple things on page 416. One of them is the importance of experience. Now, Heidegger was technically not an existentialist thinker, but he certainly belonged to that milieu. And for a while early on, he was thought of as an existentialist thinker because he belongs to that realm of trying to bring in human being in the world as part of the way that we need to philosophize, part of the way that we need to think. What does it mean to be in the world, and how does our actual experience matter? That word experience is highlighted here by his student Gadamer, right? So he's saying here at the top of page 416, this is what makes calculation possible, the discovery of relations from the formal laws of the systems of combination, independently of whether or not experience presents us with relationships between things corresponding to those combinations, right? And so he's saying, there's calculations are possible separate from experience, but he's bringing experience into the conversation. And then he says a few lines later, but it is a universal truth that human imperfection precludes adequate knowledge a priori, that is, before, and that experience is indispensable. So he's saying, look, there's a problem here with the way that we're thinking of calculation, of a prioritizing or a privileging of number as a paradigm in a disembodied way. Experience is integral to the way that we think, to the way that we develop our ideas. So then that's he's going to carry on talking about Leibniz a little bit, and that leads him to say this on the bottom of page 416, and this is the quotation that I put in the introduction. From this ideal, it becomes clear that language is something other than a mere sign system denoting the totality of objects. A word is not just a sign. In a sense that is hard to grasp, it is also something almost like a copy or image. We need only think of the other extreme possibility of a purely artificial language to see the relative justification of such an archaic theory of language. A word has a mysterious connection with what it images. It belongs to its being. Now, for us, we may not be 100% clear on how we get here. I accept that. But what I want to do is encourage you in the hunt. And what I want to do is to alert you to the way that a contemporary philosopher is articulating a view that for many of us with our modernist and pseudo or our modernist scientific assumptions just sounds hokey, sounds outdated. It sounds perhaps fundamentalist, univocal. Gadamer knows that. Gadamer senses that. That's why he says, we need only think of the relative of the other extreme possibility to see the relative justification of such an archaic theory of language. He knows that what he's saying sounds archaic. It takes us all the way back to that first paragraph in this reading. But he wants something from that. And notice how he shelters it, right? He's not just an animist. He says a word is a mysterious connection. There's something about this, right? And then he launches into his full discussion of this on pages 417 and 418. Now, he's not going to give us the answer to, who is it that comes up with this? Not in this section. He's going to do that at the beginning in the next section, and we're gonna use him a little bit in passing, but we're going to use someone else for pursuing that discussion. But let's just see what it is that he wants. Over on page 417, thinking about abstraction and Greek conceptuality. In my view, this path leads us away from the nature of language. Language and thinking about things are so bound together. Okay, so this is what we want. The language and thinking are so bound together that it is an abstraction to conceive of the system of truths as a pre-given system of possibilities of being for which a signifying subject selects corresponding signs. A word is not a sign that one selects, nor is it a sign that one makes or gives to another. It is not an existent thing that one picks up. Here, can you feel the language of the tool here, right? It is not an existent thing that one picks up and gives an ideality of meaning in order to make another being visible through it. That is mistaken on both counts. Rather, the ideality of the meaning lies in the word itself. It is meaningful already. So words are meaningful in and of themselves, not simply as tools to point to a reality that you think that you can know in a pure way apart from language. Gadamer is saying that you can't know without language, and that you do your thinking in language. Language is part of being all the way down. So maybe, at this point, you might be having this hesitation. Well, wait a minute, I thought that we were talking about the ontotheological synthesis and that everyone assumed that everything was connected. It's true. It's true that the realm of the divine, the realm of the human, and the realm of the physical world are thought to be interconnected. But still within this, language is given second place. And that, I've got a dragonfly with me. Language is given second place and basically demoted from having a proper place within the system. In a way, you could say that what Augustine is going to do is he's going to describe properly how or the place of language within this understanding of being and of interconnectedness. So this next little bit we're going to unpack, because this is the positive view now. We're going to unpack this over the next couple of weeks using a little bit of Gadamer. Gadamer has read through another thinker, and Augustine, all of them together. But let's just, so the stakes aren't high here, but let's just try to begin to wrestle with what we want from a view of language. This does not imply, on the other hand, that the word precedes all experience and simply advenes to an experience in an external way by subjecting itself to it. Experience is not wordless to begin with, subsequently becoming an object of reflection by being named, by being subsumed under the universality of the word. Rather, experience of itself seeks and finds words that express it. This is very bizarre. We seek the right word, the word that really belongs to the thing, so that in it, the thing comes into language. Okay, so some pretty weird concept here, but concept's the wrong word because concept always implies abstraction. Gadamer is seeking a description of language that binds it to things and to experiences as things. That language is part and parcel of being as action. Remember action from that reading of the Carney reading? And action as integral to the very definition of the real. Okay, so that's the positive vision. That's where we're going to be going to in the next couple of weeks. It's going to be a vision that really elevates language and rhetoric to the very description of what reality is. And so where we're headed is an understanding of language that makes the way forward for the development of civilization. Language is going to have a central place in our confidence that the world is knowable. So in a way, rhetoricians belong at the heart of the intellectual enterprise. And that's not in the, again, modern sense that, well, you know what a rhetorician is someone who can manipulate language. Rhetoricians are good used car salesmen. Rhetoricians are spin doctors. Rhetoricians are the people that make politics happen, and politics is all bullshit. It's just about striving for power and then controlling power once you get it. Is that what we really think that politics is? Do we not think that politics is actually part of our species being as humans? Is it all jadedness? Is rhetoric simply a tool? What Augustine bequeaths to the West is an understanding of the relationship between language and being that gives confidence that we can know the world. That we truly are connected with it in our minds, in our thoughts, in our actions, in our interactions with others, that our very talking together is our being, gives us a very elevated sense of what language can be. Okay, so let's just look at this last paragraph. Bottom page 417 and 418. So this is the last time that we'll be really concentrating on the Greek thinkers. So just to summarize here. If Greek philosophy does not want to admit this relationship between word and thing, speech and thought, the reason, no doubt, is that thought had to protect itself against the intimate relationship between word and thing in which the speaker lives. So Plato and Aristotle are both trying to elevate the possibility of thought, and they think that it needs to be protected. So there's a kind of dominion, and this is going back to the sophists, of language over thought. that is a concern. Nietzsche points to this as well. So from early on, Greek philosophers fought against this confusion. And this is where he says, this was already true in Parmenides. We don't need to be concerned about him, but pre-Socratic thinker. Certainly after the Platonic turn to discourse. Followed by Aristotle's orienting the forms of being to the form of assertion. So Gadamer is just simply saying, you're like, Aristotle's doing something similar to Plato. Really, there's an ideal of a realm of thought, or logos. Because here, orientation to the eidos was conceived as determining the logos, the notion that language should have a being of its own could only be regarded as a confusion. And to banish and control it was the purpose of thought. Okay. So that's where we leave things for this week. And this really does set up the turn that comes through Augustine within this ontotheological synthesis. We'll explore that in the next couple of weeks. All right, that's it for now.